everyone, welcome back to Inside Gaming Previews. We're gonna run out of post-its at this point, but there it is. Today we're talking about Diablo 4, and before y'all gamer gators get up on my yes, my girlfriend works for Blizzard, and specifically she works on Diablo, but she wasn't involved in any of me getting to play it. I just got a media badge and then went to the media room where they had demo machine set up, and that's where I played it, so that's where all of these impressions are coming from. They also did a panel at BlizzCon that, you know, media access and stuff I got to watch, and it wasn't like public, so maybe there's some info in that you don't know about Diablo 4 yet, and we'll be going over that too. There you go, there's your disclaimer. I played the game honestly, and we'll give you honest opinions about it. So to start, I think the big thing that everyone is kind of excited about is the visuals or the tone of the game. Definitely going back more to Diablo 2, and having played it, I can attest to that. It's got those harsh, long shadows, a very muted kind of color palette, very high contrast, as opposed to Diablo 3, which had kind of a more normal color spread. It still had its moments of being metal, Diablo 3 did, but Diablo 4 definitely more of Diablo 2, in that it's a lot of like beiges and earth tones, and like and that makes the blood pop a lot, and there's a fair amount of blood. One thing I did notice, and it's hard to tell if this is like intentional artistic design or if it's just preview stuff, but the demo started with like my adventurer crawling through a cave or whatever, and the walls were kind of collapsing behind them, and they had drop frame animation, so the main character was moving at like 60 FPS, and the walls and stuff were kind of animating at 20, and it was actually a really cool look. It kind of reminded me of the old school claymation style of just like really chunky animations that looked really smooth, but didn't quite match the scrolling of the world and stuff like that. It still worked, and it gave the game a unique aesthetic, and I think they're onto something there with doing that on purpose. It does give the game a kind of more, almost like playing in a diorama feel, which is kind of what Diablo always has been with its isometric view and everything like that. So in addition to just the color palette and the graphic design, I do think there are other animation things in which they're kind of paying homage to what Diablo was before 3, which is exciting, unless that was unintentional for the preview. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I liked it. So I kind of hope that that's an intentional thing, and we'll keep playing that way. Right on to the gameplay. And this is gonna be a mix of like my impressions and then what we saw in the panel. For starters, there will be 5 classes. The Sorceress, Barbarian, and Druid have been announced so far, and they were playable in the demo. I played the Sorceress because I like throwing around big magical sparks and stuff. One thing I did notice popping open that inventory tab is that the stats are casual as hell. Every piece of gear only has attack and defense on it, and then maybe some environmental attribute, fire, ice, or lightning, or something like that. I poked around a little bit and couldn't even find a stats screen, so like Diablo 3 is pretty casualized too. It distills everything into DPS. There is some nuance below that, and there is a full stat screen in the game somewhere, but typically all you have to care about is your class's operative stat and like attacks per second, based on what class you're playing. So it is interesting that Diablo 4, on appearances, seems to be rolling it back even further than that, which I'm gonna be honest, I'm kind of okay with. I think a lot of people would read that into it being less of a core RPG. I tend to think more like, well, why is that stat there if it doesn't matter? So, you know, if you're a wizard or whatever, why do you care about dexterity? Why even have it there? And if that's not even a stat on all the gear that's dropping for you, well, again, why does it matter? So I kind of don't mind that, provided that the gameplay still has some intricacy to it, which it kind of seems like it does. On to that point, there is a dodge, that's back from D3, but it kind of means a little more now. Encounters kind of rely on you having a dodge. Again, I'll get to that in a second. It's got potions still, but they're instant instead of like the Diablo 3 style of you knock one back and then it gives you a heal over time up until the point. I kind of like that because I feel like in Diablo 3, if enemies weren't hitting you faster than the potion was healing you, you would never die. You could just keep chain chugging like energy drinks and be fine. It wasn't always like that, but sometimes it was like that. This is more like you get an instant heal if there's an oh shit moment and you take a hit you weren't supposed to, but the cooldown on the potion is long. It was like 20 seconds or so. So they definitely, at least in the demo, have tuned it so you can't just potion feed your way through a fight. It's your uh-oh button or I made a mistake button, but if you keep taking hits, you'll go down. The spells that I had as a sorceress did imply some amount of gameplay intelligence too. And I'm mostly gonna be contrasting with Diablo 3 here, but for me, Diablo 3 was really about finding a combo of skills and runes that all played together really well. And it wasn't necessarily that playing together was super important, it just determined how far ahead of the level curve you smashed the difficulty of the game. So it was whether or not you killed this boss in 12 seconds as opposed to 15. This seems more like crowd control and status effects really matter. So there was like a one that would conjure up like a cone of ice to freeze enemies in place, and then there was another big meteor that took like 2 or 3 seconds to actually hit. So you have some, you know, basic crowd control stuff where you pull enemies into a choke, you drop your little freezy arena there so they all have to walk through it, they all get locked into place, you cast your big fireball, you hit them all. Okay, I'm into it. That's still a little bit more than Diablo 3 had. The big thing about me is the fight mechanics. And this is, in this regard, it's a little more like Diablo 2 than Diablo 3. So in the dungeon that I went to, there were a lot of fallen shamans that resurrect people. So essentially, like, you had to make value-weighted judgments. If you walk into a room, there's like 20 small goblin mans and 1 shaman. Do you try to cut your way through the horde wards to the shaman to prevent him from resurrecting everyone? So do you thin out the herd first and then go after him? Or do you just dodge your way in, try to assassinate him, dodge your way out, hopefully you can stay alive? That's kind of neat. Again, shades more gameplay intricacy than Diablo 3 really had. In the panel, they also talked about some other unit types that were kind of like this. They mentioned a skeletal ballista that basically can fire this huge railgun arrow at you from like 2 or 3 screens away. So do you try to dodge around it while you're dealing with the enemies that are swarming you? Or do you try to bypass them all, take care of the ballista, and then try to work the crowds from there? I really appreciate the risk-reward mechanics that used to be pretty heavy in Diablo about prioritizing certain targets and exercising your knowledge about their attack patterns and their AI. Again, too early to tell, but that early glimmer is pretty nice. There were some other things that I found in the dungeon that I went to. So essentially the demo was structured to basically they throw you in the open world and you have about 15 minutes to play the game. And what I did, I opened up that map. I thought it was kind of cool. Dungeons have explicit levels, so you can actually choose where to go, and it's not all scaling to your character apparently, so that's neat. I have some questions about that, but that's neat. I went to the highest level dungeon I could find because on one level I am a pro gamer, but on the other level, I also wanted to see if this game like stood the test of being difficult. To a degree it did, but it's also a demo, and they usually tune demos so that everyone can beat them and have a good time. I'm not gonna like judge its difficulty really. I was mostly just trying to test the gameplay mechanics, but it was a neat dungeon. There were lots of doors. It was very obviously randomly generated, but there were doors. I found this like haunted treasure chest. It was like, oh, you have to stay alive for like 2 minutes, and then it would hit me with this combo of the ice nova bombs that would freeze you in place, and then the treasure chest would pop out these fireballs. The fireballs were easy to dodge unless you were frozen in place, and then that 1-2 hit would basically one-shot you if you ever got hit by it. So you're in there mixing it up with skeletons and little goblin mans, and you got to watch out to not get frozen and not get hit with these fireballs. I appreciated it. And also on that note, the amount of enemies that it threw at me was pretty impressive. You know, at a count, I want to say like 20 or 30. It's one of those old Diablo moments where you're cruising through a dungeon, everything's fine, and then you open a door and suddenly this just torrent of horrors come at you. And it's one of those like, eyebrow-raising moments where you got to back up a little bit and start whittling down the herd. That's a good feeling, as opposed to, honestly, like Diablo 3, where you could just kill everything all the time, just by mashing all the buttons, so I appreciated that difference. But now we can get more into sort of the gameplay intricacy of it, so based on my experience with the sorceress, the most I ever saw was like, use this skill, and then use that skill. Great. And they're on pretty heavy cooldown, so you kind of have to be judicious about when you use your skills. I definitely hit some points in combat. My cooldowns weren't up, or I didn't have mana, so it wasn't just about mashing every skill all the time. In the panel, they talked about some even more interesting stuff. So they basically talked about skills or stat bonuses that trigger on various like proc moments. So for example, they gave as a druid, they mentioned you can like through the rune system, which again I'll talk about in a second. Every time you shift into bear form, you can get a damage buff, but shifting into bear form happens by using certain skills. It's not like hitting a button to turn into bear. It's more like big swipe, turns you into a bear for the duration of the attack, and then you turn back. So that's kind of neat. Shades of the rune system where certain abilities are tied to certain skills, but you know, maybe not quite so overpowered. The skill progression looks pretty normal for Diablo 2, essentially. You have a skill tree, and every time you level up, you get a point. You can find skill tomes to get more points, and it's the same old thing of like each skill unlocks a new ability, or you can rank it up to make it more powerful. At the bottom, they have mastery skills, and this was kind of interesting too. Essentially, it was like everything was a fundamental upgrade to your character with one little twist. So for example, the sorceress had a buff at the bottom of the skill tree that said lightning damage would increase by 40%, but only at melee range. So that's the sort of thing that kind of changes the way you play a character and the way you think about using their skills. There was another one that, again, for the sorceress, would remove the freeze status effect. So if you cast cold and an enemy gets chilled, it doesn't stop in place anymore, but it does increase critical damage by 30% on enemies that are chilled. So if you play it right and change the way you play, theoretically you can do more damage fundamentally and beat harder bosses. I'm into the idea. We'll see how it's executed. The other interesting thing about Diablo 4 is that it's an open world now. And to a degree that sounds weird because other Diablo games were, you know, kind of air quotes open world, but they were more like zones that you would move through that were pretty big. This is actually open world where like it's a giant world, and as you're walking, there's no loading between zones. You just kind of cross into a new area. Again, from the panel, there will be 5 complete regions, each with a day-night cycle and weather. That sounds a little buzzwordy. I don't know if that's going to matter to the game at all, but you know, that's kind of neat. Makes it feel like more of a full breathing world. Like I said before, I did appreciate that dungeons had explicit level markations on them. That does kind of imply a question for me. So let's say that I, an elite pro gamer, want to go to a high level dungeon because I want the challenge and I want to level faster and find better gear. Okay, if I can opt to do that, that's cool. But then what does that mean for like the story quest line or side quests or anything like that? Do I go do hard level stuff and then have to play a story quest that I'm way over leveled for? Do I have to like be bored for a little bit just to get through the story because I like playing harder stuff? I don't know. There will probably be some kind of overarching difficulty setting, but That is kind of the double-edged sword of not having everything scale to your level all the time, is that if you choose to, you can break the leveling curve, and then when you have to go back for one reason or another, you're just kind of babysitting enemies that you sneeze at and they evaporate. One thing I thought was neat is that, given that it is an open world now, you can open the map, put a little objective there, and it'll actually draw a little pathway for you to follow. So, I don't know. I mean, that's not a new thing in video games, but it's new to Diablo, and it felt weird. As a result, you can also have mounts. You can get on a horse, because apparently the world's really big, so that's kind of interesting. And another thing that I think some people saw in the gameplay is that when you go into town, there are other players running around. So it also has dynamic matchmaking in the open world. And this is something that they talked about fairly extensively in the panel, because I think they rightly understood that people would be worried that Diablo would just suddenly look like RuneScape. Is that you'd be out there murdering demons in a hellscape, but there'd be a million other people wandering around asking for free stuff and offering to pay you to be their girlfriend and what have you. Which, you know, you can make some good money if you know how to pretend to be a lady online. The way that they described it is, dungeons are private and randomly generated. So every time you go into a dungeon, you're on your own, or with whatever party you brought with you. Campaign areas start as private until you do the story objective there. So essentially, every time you go into a new area or a place where there's a story event happening, you're not gonna have a million level 60 dudes running through with gleaming golden armor, presumably because also they need to maintain some level of story consistency. If it's just you as a Nephilim fighting the minions of Lilith, it wouldn't make sense for you to show up and have a bunch of other Nephilim there, all murdering everything. So I kind of like that approach, is that every time you go into a place, it's gonna be Diablo style until you beat it, and then you'll start to see other people wandering around, but only in town. They did mention that when you're out in the wilderness, they don't want to make it seem like the world is crowded, because Diablo is supposed to be a pretty lonesome experience. So you go into town, you see everybody running around with all their sweet gear, but the second you go out into the wilderness, maybe one or two people is how they described it. Every couple of hours you might see them wandering around, but mostly you're going to be on your own. So I'm kind of into that. There is another thing that's kind of interesting, is that there are world bosses, and to some degree some of this starts to sound a little like Destiny, and I know that I kind of tend to relate a lot of games to that, but I've just been playing a lot of it, so sue me. In the sense that you have your towns, which are like the tower, and that's where you just get matchmaked with everybody. When you go into a zone, it is kind of an open world experience. You have your mount, and then if you find a world event or a world boss, then other players will start to get matchmaked into that zone. So the one that you saw was that giant like pincher man boy. That's like a world boss that's meant to be fought by like 15 people at once. And that's the sort of thing where they hadn't really talked about it, but I assume it's just like you just happen upon it while you're out fighting stuff. The thing they did talk about was those world boss encounters have their own mechanics. So for the little pinchery stabby man, they did talk about how if you did the right things in the right order, you could stagger the boss, and then if you attack the right thing, then you can break off pieces of the boss. So that almost sounds a little Monster Hunter-y, just a little bit, and also maybe like heroic public events in Destiny. If you know a particular mechanic or a particular interaction with a particular boss, then you can break stuff off of it. I'm assuming that will lead to getting materials or items that you can use in crafting. I don't know, it's kind of neat. And then also they mentioned that if you do certain damage to the boss, if you break off their arms, it does remove certain attacks from their pool. So the big stabby man, he had this giant swipe, while if you knock off one of his claws, that reduces the range of that massively, which probably makes the boss a lot easier to kill. So these are all neat ideas, and I think they can work pretty well in Diablo. They did also talk about the end game a little bit, and this is honestly what has me most intrigued, because kind of like I was saying, pro gamer, and I also like games when they have really intricate and decision-based gameplay mechanics, and it sounds like they're leaning into that pretty hard with Diablo 4, or at least I hope. Maybe I was being a little too rosy about it, but they did talk about the rune system, which is essentially like, instead of just like a gem being plus 30% thunder damage or whatever, one rune is essentially an establishing action and the other rune is the effect. So when I was playing, I got a rune that was like, oh, you get 30% critical, and I would just put it in, but it said that it required activation, and I was like, well, what does that mean? And then I got another rune that basically said, whenever you use a potion, activate the next rune. I'm like, oh, neat. So essentially you make these strings of status effects that you can construct for yourself. So every time I used a potion, I got 30% critical for like 7 seconds. That's neat. And that's important because it factors into what they talk about in the end game, which is that you will get these keys, which are just items that drop in the world, and those keys will upgrade an existing dungeon to an end game difficulty of varying rank. And apparently it adds what they call affixes or modifiers that increase the difficulty. They mentioned a couple of things like all the enemies are invisible unless they're in combat, double bosses. They did even show footage of this like rock that would just float after you and occasionally pulse out lightning damage. So now if you combine those two things, the runes and these endgame dungeons, now you can start to see a vision of like, okay, I have this key, and when I use it, it's gonna add this stupid rock that's gonna follow me around and do lightning damage. So maybe I throw in all of these runes on my gear that says every time I take lightning damage, I get double damage for a little bit. And then suddenly you can turn something that might kill you into something that helps you beat the dungeon. And that's what I'm into. I'm kind of into a game that that puts the rules in front of you and then lets you exercise your planning and decision making on how you execute it. My hope is that they're really hard and that it takes a lot of game skill and game intelligence to figure out, but we'll see. So there's a lot I think to like about Diablo 4 right now in terms of the way it plays and the way it looks. I do have some open questions though. The leveling is one thing I'm curious about. Another is that exchange between player skill, player interaction, and leveling. So it's weird. In terms of like action RPGs that have a mathematical system behind them, there's kind of like two barriers between player ability. One is that I'm so over leveled that I can't possibly lose. The other is that I'm so under leveled that I can't possibly win. Like mathematically, those are sort of the boundaries. And in between, you have player ability and player button hitting being the X factor. So in my experience in Diablo 3, that boundary was actually pretty slim. What you didn't matter a whole lot if you built your character right and were just mashing all your cooldowns. So I'm hoping that gulf is a little wider in Diablo 4. It remains to be seen. Obviously, that's something that you have to play a game for 60 hours to figure out. And then also just, yeah, the leveling curve thing of like, if I go off and do all this hard stuff, then when I come back to do the story, am I gonna be fighting level 1s while I'm a level 50 just because I didn't want to be bored by the story this entire time? But now I have to be because I want to see the credits or whatever. We'll see. These are all open questions. The thing is, I think this game's pretty far away from launching. In the panel, they said this game is not soon. It's not even Blizzard soon. So that's probably more than a year away. More than a year. They did say it's coming to PC, Xbox, and PS4, but who knows when? Not even who knows Blizzard when. So now we're in the long dark of having to wait until this game comes out. But I'm intrigued. What has me curious though, is by the time this game comes out, we're gonna have a lot more games. I know that Path of Exile 2 just got announced, so everyone's really hot and jazzed about that. Regardless, I'm looking forward to it. I think there's a lot to look forward to. So thank you, Blizzard, for inviting me to BlizzCon and giving me the chance to play Diablo 4. Thank you guys for watching this preview. If you have any questions about the game, just leave them below. There's probably a lot I didn't address. Probably not a lot I can address, but that's all I've got for you right now. So thank you for watching. Catch you next time. Welcome to Inside Gaming. Today we're previewing Overwatch 2, and right at the top, let me just address the elephant in the room. I know a lot of you are still a little raw about Blizzard. I get that. I want to respect that. So just don't watch. I hate to be that. I mean that for real. I want to respect your